Writing doesn't have to be a solitary activity. That's why we host in-person retreats and workshops. At the Writing Excuses retreats, you'll get access to classes, one-on-one office hours, critique sessions, and activities to keep you inspired and motivated. Become a more engaging storyteller and learn how to navigate the publishing landscape. As you make meaningful progress on your stories, you'll also build connections with your fellow writers that will last for years to come. Check out our upcoming events at writingexcuses.com/retreats.
This episode of Writing Excuses has been brought to you by our listeners, patrons, and friends. If you would like to learn how to support this podcast, visit www.patreon.com/writingexcuses. Season 20, Episode 6. This is Writing Excuses.
History and Community.
I'm Mary Robinette.
I'm Erin.
I'm Dongwon.
And I'm Howard.
And today we are going to continue our discussion of The Lens of Who by talking about what your character brings with them from who they are, their identity at its core, the communities that they came up in. Like, how much do you need to know, question for the group, about who your character was before they entered the story in order to tell it effectively?
I find that I often don't know the answer to that when I start writing, that sometimes I will be writing and will discover a thing later as I go, that then I have to go back and layer into the early part of the story before I have made that discovery in order to have my character make sense and have them have continuity. In a beautiful, perfect world, I will have sat down and I will figure out how old they are and how many siblings they are. But a lot of times, especially when I'm doing short fiction, I just start writing.
You can backfill that information as you go, I think, in a lot of ways, and, like you're saying, it's not that you have to have pre-written the document ahead of time of knowing that here's the town they grew up in here, whatever, but be prepared that when something comes up to find the answer in that moment and give them that context that they're missing, right?
I actually think the layering and backfilling that you're talking about are actually the key things that I really want to talk about in this episode, which is how does the lens of identity and community, how does that weigh on the story? Mm-hmm. And the reason I mention it that way is because sometimes I'll read people's work and they will have a fact about their character, they grew up in this neighborhood, or they were an orphan and they grew up eating from the trash can on the streets, as people do in fantasy worlds often. And it's like, I hear that, but then when I read the story, if you had never told me that about the character, I would never know it. Mm-hmm. It doesn't feel like it has any actual narrative weight. So how do we give the identity of our characters narrative weight in the story?
I think it is a lot of the... It winds up affecting the choices that you make. Mm. For instance, if I am, if I have to walk down a dark street at night, I am going to make different choices than, a 6-foot white guy who lifts. I will be evaluating things extremely differently. And so for me, this gets into something that we'll be talking about later. It gets into some of the reactions that the character makes, and also the language that they use to describe things, the internal reactions that they have. All of those things are informed by their history, their experiences.
Yeah, I mean, as we're talking about this, I can't stop thinking about a meme that already feels dated, and by the time this comes out, will feel truly fossilized. But the whole, you didn't just fall out of a coconut tree yesterday, right? You exist in the context of all that came before, right? Mm-hmm. And the thing is when a character feels like they fell out of the tree yesterday, that's when it feels like a failure state, right?
Yeah.
And, like you're saying, you can say the detail out loud of oh, they grew up on the street, but then they walk into a restaurant and order all the food and feel so comfortable in that. It's it's is that really a character who just came off the street, right? Or what is the context that led to that? And so it's not that you have to pre-write all the context before, but you do need a consistency of it. When you introduce something, you need to make sure that feels felt in the choices, in the work, in how you're describing it and how they speak and what they do.
This is a this is a micro scale version of the game that I'm always playing with the macro of world building, where I have to look at the implications of a thing that I've put in my world. If this character is someone who grew up during the Great Depression, or lived through the Great Depression, they have behaviors that don't make sense to me. Lot of hoarding of things that don't necessarily need to be hoarded. It's something that you'd find from that generation, and so I'm always asking myself, are there implications that I need to examine of whatever this backstory is? And sometimes I invert it. I have the character do a thing, and then I ask myself, this is an implication. This was implied by something in their backstory that I don't know yet. Mm-hmm. What is that thing? Should I write that thing now? Or should I just put a pin in it? Maybe have another character put a pin in it for me. Hey, why are you hoarding mason jars? Why are you keeping mason jars? And nobody answers the question, but now my readers aren't going to pester me about it because another character asked the question, and now we know that it's obviously justified because someone else wondered why it was there.
Can I offer a very specific example from something that I wrote where I had to backfill character? So I have this whole Lady Astronaut series, and it started with a book, a novelette called The Lady Astronaut of Mars. And in that, my character Elma, who in the novels is Jewish, is not Jewish. That's not a decision I had made for her. And I'm not even certain that she's Southern. I think she probably is. But there's a line in Lady Astronaut of Mars in which she talks about eating crawfish as a child, which is not something that most Jewish kids who are observant would do. So when I went back to write Calculating Stars, and I had made the decision to have Elma be Jewish for a number of different structural plot reasons, I had to come up with the backstory that would have allowed her to have that experience as a child. And that then informed every decision that she made going through the story, and then every subsequent thing. And it is something that I have both discovered, but also that I had to shape the lens through which she was viewing the world in order to have that make sense and have a consistency for the character. That her family grew up secular because her father was in the military, and they were trying to mask the fact that they were Jewish to outsiders.
Mm-hmm. What I love about this story is, there's a little bit of a way in which we've been talking about this so far that almost makes it feel like a burden. Like, how do you keep track of it? How do you have this consistency? But what I love about it is the way in which history and identity and community are opportunities, right? Like, you found a thing and that gave you an opportunity to make the character feel more interesting and nuanced and three-dimensional, right? They're all of these elements of introducing aspects of a character's context, of their history, of their connection, are storytelling prompts for you to then fill out your world more, to find plot in it, right? And, it's what I love about characters and role-playing games is that you'll just say a thing or introduce a thing, then it's suddenly like, oh, the whole character's descending from this one prompt that, a turn of phrase that they use or an attitude that they had. Aaron, you and I were in a game together recently, and I introduced a character who was extremely cantankerous and fought with everybody. And so then the question kind of became a little bit, why is she like this? And then we developed a whole relationship of like, oh, she was siblings with your character and like all these other things. And the joy for me is finding that opportunity and letting that be a seed for character, story, conflict, all the things that we want to make a story work.
Yeah, I think that to me, like, identity is such an important thing, and it drives a lot of the trying to figure out why a character is the way they are and all the things that they carry with them is a huge part of writing for me. I think it's why I love voice so much. And I think that a lot of times we think of identity as noun based. It's about the things, like this person carries this item or eats this food or, goes to this place of worship or what have you. But I think that, and Mary Robinette, you sort of alluded to this earlier, to me, the interesting thing about identity is identity as a verb. The way you make choices, the way that you take action in a situation is going to be hoarding, is that's a verb. Do you know what I mean? Like the mason jar isn't the important thing. It is the collecting, the keeping, the fear of things being taken away from you. And I think that really thinking about how can we take identity from feeling like a noun, which I think can sometimes make things feel more shallow. Like I added all the right nouns. How come this person doesn't feel like they embody this identity? It's because their verbs haven't changed.
Yes.
Only the nouns have.
Yes.
There's a 90s sitcom. I can't remember the name. I don't think it ran past one season, but it had Jenna Elfman in it. And at one point, she is very upset that she's going to this place and she's not going to identify with anybody. She comes from lower income or something. I don't remember. And her brother says, "You'll be fine. Y'all were raised by the same TV." I remember loving that line because in the 90s, we were kind of all raised by the same TV. But that's no longer a thing. There's a different set of we weren't all raised by the same YouTube, the same CNN.com. The disparity of pop culture background or the diversity of it is so significant now that you can't all be raised by the same TV. And so I now ask myself often, rather than, what are the implications or, what is this, how is this one character different in terms of background? I ask myself, how is everyone the same on any point and why? What is it that they would all have in common? How could they possibly have all that in common?
Which is a great time to say that something that all of our episodes have in common is a break. And we'll be right back after it.
I always recommend writers have their own websites. It's important to have a place on the web where you can make sure people can find your press kit, upcoming releases, and bibliography. Even if you're not published yet, being out there and establishing a digital identity is incredibly important. So when Kinsta reached out, we thought they'd be a good fit for our audience's needs. They take care of the technical stuff so you can focus on your writing. Kinsta provides managed hosting for WordPress, offering lightning-fast load times, top-tier security, and unmatched human-only customer support. They offer you complete peace of mind by ensuring that your WordPress sites are always online, secure, and performing at their best. Kinsta provides enterprise-grade security and is one of the few hosting providers for WordPress with SOC 2 and other certifications that guarantee the highest level of security for your website. And Kinsta customers can experience up to 200% faster sites by simply moving their WordPress sites to the platform. They even have a user-friendly custom dashboard called My Kinsta that makes managing your site or multiple sites a breeze. My Kinsta is packed with a range of features that simplify site management, including tools for cache control, debugging, redirects, geolocation, and even CDN setup. And thanks to their unlimited, free, expert-led migrations, Kinsta ensures a smooth transition from other hosting providers, so you won't experience any downtimes. Plus, their 24/7, 365 human-only support is available in multiple languages, ready to assist with any inquiries, regardless of site complexity. Ready to experience Kinsta's hosting for yourself? Get your first month free when you sign up at Kinsta.com today. It's the perfect opportunity to see why Kinsta is trusted by thousands of businesses worldwide to power their websites. Visit KINSTA.com to get this limited time offer for new members on select plans. Don't miss out. Get started for free today.
All right, thinking a little more about identity and community. So we've talked a little bit about what you do with it, but how do you, and I feel like I've said this in an earlier Who episode, how do you actually figure out what your character's identity should be? You talked about making a character Jewish for specific story reasons. Is it when we're picking the identity, the community of our characters, what are things that we should be looking out for so that we can find those opportunities to make our stories richer?
I have talked about this in previous episodes, the wonderful book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And this introduced me to the idea of axis of powers, which is why when I needed, with Elma, I made her Jewish, was that I try to think about where my character sits in axes of power. Where do they have power? Where do they not have power? And I try to make sure that all of my characters have at least 2 areas where they do not feel like they have power, where they feel subordinate in the larger society. Because that introduces vulnerability, but it also often introduces some of their strengths, some of the ways that they define themselves. So that was one of the reasons that I did that with Elma, was that in Lady Astronaut of Mars, she's older, she's a caretaker. Both of those are sliders on that axis of power that are farther down. But when I move all the way back to Calculating Stars, she's young, she's beautiful, she's smart. And I didn't have enough sliders that were lower on the power structure. And it was 1952. So I made that choice. But for me, that's what I start looking for, is where do they feel like they are lacking in power, and where do they have power that they are unaware of?
Mm-hmm. I love axes of power as a framework here. And I think kind of ties into how I think about it, which is about stakes, right? When you have a character, plot derives from character in my mind because of stakes, because of characters, how they relate to other characters, how they feel about them, how they feel about themselves, right? And so when you're looking at what stakes do I want this character to have, what relationships are at risk by choices that they make, or what pressures are put on them by the world that puts those relationships at stake, that leads you to the point where you're now asking questions about history and community, right? Who are they connected to? What history do they have with that person? And why is that relevant for the story I'm trying to tell, right? You get to plot by developing these stakes. But as you're asking questions of what is this book about? Why am I writing this book? I think that's where you get to start layering in those pieces of history and identity and a sense of self.
One of the other things that when you were talking about community, one of the other things that I have begun using as a shorthand since we did the space economy camp is thinking about the idioms that they grew up with, because those shape the opinions that we have. They are parts that we often don't interrogate, because it's like, well, everybody says no such thing as a free lunch. But that's extremely different. If you grow up with that as your truism, it's extremely different than somebody who grows up with their core idiom, their core truism as rising tide raises all boats. Like those are 2 different ways of interacting with community. And so I will often think about how the community defines that, where the community sits with that, and if my character embraces that or if they push against it.
One thing I really like to think about with axes of power is who's aware of them. So one of the biggest things that, like, there are many definitions of privilege, but one of the definitions is the ability to ignore the axis of power because you're really high on it. So why do you care? Because I always think about, I know the book you're talking about, why are all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? And I remember talking to Black friends about it at the time, being like, well, why do all the white kids sit together in the cafeteria? Because they do too. And so, but it's like no one ever asked that question because there's an idea that that's a default.
Yeah.
Like that, why wouldn't they? That's just Jimmy hanging out with Jen. Versus like if I'm hanging out with somebody, then something is wrong there. Something is off. And so being able to recognize the axes of power and what your relationship is to them. Do you understand where you are in the world? Like, do you understand the axis of power that you're on, or is it one that you either can ignore or that you're in denial about? Like, what is the relationship? I also think it's interesting to think about, like, I love relationships between individuals and structures.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's like you and an axis of power, or you and community. Are you someone feeling like you're in the midst of your community, well embraced by them? Do you feel on the outskirts of one community, but the in another? And how close are they to how you view yourself? If a community that you think is very core to who you are is also one that you feel at odds with, that's a very different character than one who comes from the exact same community, but who feels like they are the absolute, like, I am that community. We view things exactly the same way. We use the same idioms. We do the same things. And so I think thinking about how your character relates not just to other people, but to other structures is a really fun way to think about it.
Yeah.
One piece that I want to come back to is the idea of these lenses as a way to examine or a way the audience experiences the story. We're talking a lot about who these characters are, what their history, their tradition, their influences, so on and so forth. Sometimes I'll have to ask myself whether the plot MacGuffin action, whatever it is that needs to happen to resolve things, could that have been done by anyone? Or can it only be done by someone who came from this tradition? Because those are actually two very different stories. I like the story where anybody could have solved the problem if, they brought tools to bear and tried to solve the problem. But this character solved the problem in this way because of who they were. And that, for me, those are the stories that feel the most real. Those are the stories that when I read them, I feel like I could have been that person. I am experiencing the story as if I were there.
You're making me think of something, just tying it back to something that Aaron was saying, was just that you're using the tools that you have available because of the experiences that you have. And one of the things that I enjoy doing is thinking about this community, this connection. When you're looking at how to bring that to life for the character on the page, for the reader, I often think about the pieces of the community that imply larger pieces of a community. That if you say, oh yeah, I had to do that on my naming day, it's like that suddenly implies this whole that there's a whole thing about naming days. And that then implies this bigger ripple, especially if your character's like, oh my God, I had to do that on naming day. My parents made me. It's like, okay, so there's a difference. It's implying these levels of that there's more than one way to view the thing. There's more, and that then implies that there's multiple groups within a larger group, which I think is fun. I love that. But I also think that it only works. You can't do it with something that is existing in isolation. Like you can't just say, oh yes, on naming day, we all do this. It's got to be tied to the emotion of the character. It's the connections.
I mean, this to me is like the flaw of like a certain type of dystopian YA, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that was very popular, it was so focused on just like the one thing that was different and existed in isolation and just didn't feel like there was other connections to that, right? There wasn't further context. So when a character came from a place or had an identity or any of those things, it felt very reductive in a certain way, right? Like, and so without the further context and complexity, it didn't feel rich enough, right? And I think the ones that succeed very well, something like Hunger Games, does a great job of pulling in those other details, pulling in those other contexts around the central thing. And then ones that I think did not do as well were ones that failed to ask the further questions, failed to look at intersecting axes of power, failed to look at, the ways in which this event connects to all these other events that happen in a person's life, right?
And I think that's what makes it work when somebody uses a tool in an unexpected way. If there have been all these connections, you understand how they got there and how something that character A sees as oh my gosh, an obvious tool I could use, character B would never recognize as a tool at all. Do you know what I mean? And I love that type of thing where one character is like, yes, the answer is so obvious. And another character is like, I don't even understand the question.
Yeah.
And that is like such a beautiful moment of character, because even if we don't understand that culture, that identity, that context, we do understand that there are things that we know that others don't, and things that we don't understand that others live in.
When you look at these connections between characters and society and traditions and economies and there's this enormous network of things which, as a writer, you can become very, very oppressed by, because drawing a matrix in which you have defined every point and drawn every line is nightmarishly difficult. The tool that I use, you treat that matrix as a net, drop something onto the net. Where did it hit? You only need to define the threads where it landed. Those are what caught it. By defining those threads, those 3 or 4 threads, You have now implied the existence of the entire net, and the reader will believe in the entire net. Now, you have to describe those three things well. You have to describe them in ways that make sense for the character, that imply the actual history of the character. But you only need 3 or 4 things to get us to believe that that whole web of your society, of your world, of your universe, from those 3 pounds of, wet stuff between your ears, that whole universe you've created, we can believe it's real. You just got to give us 3 threads.
I think about it in, as a GM, I think about it in terms of Paduk, the game of Go, where you are not defining all the connections between all the things, but what you'll do when you're playing Go is, as a strategic move, you'll put a piece out at a distant part of the board from where you are right now, and it's communicating, I'm interested in that. I'm going to be making moves around that in the future. Hey, opponent, just so you know, we're going to be fighting about that in the future, so whatever's happening here, think about that too. And so when it comes to world building, a lot of times I will just make a lot of stub documents with nothing in them, just a title of like this culture, food here, geography over there. And I won't fill those in until they become relevant. And as soon as they start becoming relevant, then I'll go in like, okay, I need to think about this now because my characters are going over there.
Got to tie this thread off.
Exactly. And so like the net that you're talking about, you have this disparate web, but don't lose your mind trying to fill in all those details. Yeah. Take big swings when your character does interact with something, define broad things, reach for whatever their cultural contexts are, and use those to keep building as they connect.
And to come back to something we talked about at the very beginning about weight, I think weight can often sound like a burden, but to me, when you talk about building a net, it's making people feel like your world building has enough weight to catch the story.
Yeah.
And with that in mind, we're going to go to the homework, which is to identify something from your character's life from before the story begins. Identify, especially if it's something, a community, an identity, some way that they intersect with a broader world, and write a scene in which that element of the character weighs heavily on the scene, but is never explicitly mentioned.
This has been Writing Excuses. You're out of excuses. Now go write.
Writing Excuses has been brought to you by our listeners, patrons, and friends. For this episode, your hosts were Mary Robinette Kowal, Dongwon Song, Aaron Roberts, and Howard Taylor. This episode was engineered by Marshall Carr Jr., mastered by Alex Jackson, and produced by Emma Reynolds. For more information, visit writingexcuses.com.